Hey there, and welcome to Learning Peace, in a talk about human rights activism. With us are two interesting guests, Omar Shakir and Abir Joubran Dakwar. The host for this session is Jonathan Ger. So before we get started, let me introduce the guests. Omar Shakir is the Israel and Palestinian Director at Human Rights Watch. He investigates human rights abuses in Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Prior to that, in several organizations, Omar represented Guantanamo detainees, investigated the Rab'a massacre in Egypt, and the civilian consequences of US drone strikes in Pakistan. In November 2019, under order of the Israeli Minister of Interior, Arie Deri, Omar was deported from Israel, and since he is continuing his work from Jordan. Abir Joubran Dakwar is the Unit Director of Human Rights in the Occupied Territories in the Association of Civil Rights in Israel, in short ACRI. Prior to that, Abir represented Palestinians at HaMoked and Adalah. While at HaMoked, she worked on projects concerning freedom of movement in the occupied territories, the arrest of minors, and punitive house demolitions. Abir also worked to advance the rights of disabled residents in East Jerusalem while working for Bizchut. Since 2019, Abir has been serving in her current position at ACRI. So with that, let's get started.
So I'm going to take a sharp turn of pace and just talk about something very different for a while, which is the two of you personally, your personal journey. So you're both lawyers, which is every parent's dream, though perhaps human rights lawyers wasn't exactly what they had in mind. But seriously, I'd love to hear a little bit about your personal journey, how you grew up, how you ended up doing what you're doing. Omar, perhaps first?
Sure. So, as you can probably tell from my accent, I was born and raised in the U.S. My parents came from Iraq. They moved to the U.S. In the 1970s, early 80s to the United States. I studied law. I did my undergraduate in law at Stanford in California. I did a Fulbright in Syria thereafter, and I also did a master's on the East Coast of Georgetown. I graduated law school in 2013, and I knew I wanted to dedicate my life to human rights. And I had a broad area of interest. I applied for a fellowship at Human Rights Watch, and I was selected to cover Egypt. Egypt had just gone through a military coup. And we experienced probably the worst year of human rights in Egypt in its modern history. And I ended up spending a year documenting the Rab'a massacre, one of the largest single-day killings of protesters in modern world history. Over 800, likely over 1,000 Egyptians gunned down in 12 hours. And I spent a year documenting what happened in those 12 hours that led nearly 1,000 protesters to get killed. I worked on a number of other issues, but I sort of sealed my fate in working on human rights being in Egypt at that moment. I still recall memories of going to the morgue, looking at the bodies of dead protesters, being in a society that largely cheered on repression of a segment of the community. I decided after that to transition to the United States, working on human rights issues as a lawyer, practicing law like Abir does every day. And I had a fun set of first cases. I represented men detained in Guantanamo Bay. So I was going back and forth to the naval facility in a piece of territory the U.S. Manages outside Cuba, representing two men who were detained by the U.S. for over 14 years without charge. And I worked on their cases for 2 years. I also worked on cases involving free speech in the United States, including a Palestinian professor who lost a tenured faculty position for tweeting critical of Israel's 2014 bombardment of Gaza. And I worked on police surveillance of Muslim communities in New York. I was hired back to Human Rights Watch to take this job in October of 2016, and I've been in this role for nearly 4 years. As was mentioned by Jonathan in my introduction, I spent 2.5 amazing years based in Israel and Palestine, and since November I've been based in Amman, Jordan. But my commitment over my career has been to human rights. It's a product of having been born with a lot of privilege and opportunity in the United States. But I could have been born in Iraq in very different circumstances, and feeling a responsibility to document rights abuse and use the privilege that I've had to push for change in policies in the United States and across the world.
I'll be moving to Abir in a bit. I just want to ask you one delicate follow-up. Feel free to as we all read about a year and a half ago, Amnesty went through a very public issue around the well-being of its staff, especially in the light of the kinds of material that they're dealing with on a daily basis. You describe the kinds of things that you work on and the kinds of things you see, seeing massacres in Cairo and everyone else. How does one sustain that over time? How do you do what you do?
Yeah, no, it's hard. I mean, when I was in Cairo, I was fresh out of law school. And I didn't know how to keep boundaries. I was a failure of a friend and a partner and all these things. I mean, I still recall phone calls from men who were detained at 9 p.m. on a Thursday, as the weekend starts, and I would drop everything I was doing and try and go document the facts and write that press release. It was very difficult, especially documenting a mass killing. And it was a very tense time in Egypt. People were being detained for doing what I was doing. And so, I was moving from house to house. We eventually, Human Rights Watch I got kicked out of Egypt eventually, a country that I had spent a lot of time in. So Israel was not the first country to have done that. There were several, Bahrain and Syria and Egypt before that. But, I've gotten better, right? Guantanamo was hard as well, because one day I would be sitting at a base talking to somebody who's my age, who has been there for 14 years. He's fought it, not been charged with anything. My clients both at one point were cleared by the US government for release, but weren't being released. And I would be the next day back in New York City, where I lived at the time, living my normal life. And in fact, being praised for doing great work. And it was this disconnect of, what my clients faced and what I was facing. But I've learned that to be sustainable in this work, you have to have boundaries. You have to be able to give your passion to your work, which I do, but also to accept that you can't do everything, and accept that sometimes you need a vacation. Sometimes you need to disconnect and unplug. Sometimes you can't cover a case, even if it looks awful and horrific. And it's just something I struggle with all the time. You don't want to also be complacent on the other end and just feel just by showing up 9 to 5 that you're having impact. So I think it's a balance. I always think to myself that if I just do my job like anybody else, I just go in 9 to 5 and I check out, I'm actually doing a detriment, because I'm taking a job that somebody else could have and a salary to do, to just fill a chair. So I think it's a balancing act. But I wake up every day and I believe, and I'm an optimist. I believe every day. I don't think you can work on this if you don't believe that you're contributing to something. And as dark as Israel Palestine felt, for a long time, I actually in some ways feel a lot of hope, and seeing faces on this call gives me hope as well. So I think that's part of it as well.
Thank you, Omar. Abir, tell us a little bit about your personal journey. What led you to this world and to be doing the things that you do?
It's so hard to speak after Omar. My life seems boring right now. Well, I grew up in Nazareth. I went to Haifa University Law School, and I did my first degree in law and economics. And then I was a trainee in Adalah. And after that, I worked for HaMoked, especially on individual cases representing Palestinians. First with freedom of movement issues, people who are denied permits to travel abroad to get their PhD, or businessmen or women that needed treatment, and so on and so on, tens of cases. I worked also on social rights issue for Palestinians with family unification in Israel, and we started a project about minors, especially night arrest and the violation of their basic rights during arrest, and I was one of the people at HaMoked at that time who planned the strategy, the legal strategy for submitting cases for punitive home demolition, and represented some of the cases in 2015, and continued to be one of the strategy team on this matter. I did my master's degree through scholarship of the New Israel Fund through their human rights lawyers program. And my master's degrees was in American University, Washington College of Law in Washington, DC. After that, I worked for Bizchut for 2 years, developing, I wanted a change. Working in the occupied Palestinian territories, it's hard. It takes a lot of you. It's a lot of energies, especially hearing the daily struggle of people and a lot of injustice, and sometimes nothing you can do. Sometimes you go to the court, you do your best, and there is security materials that you cannot deal with. And sometimes it's frustrating. So I always wanted to deal with the issues of people with disabilities. And again, at Bizchut, they had a project. And again, I was in East Jerusalem working on this issue. Later I went back, I found that, this is the thing I want, representing Palestinians, and I went back to HaMoked, continued to develop different issues there, and later on I moved to Acre to be the head of the Occupied Palestinians unit. And today I'm working more about on principal issues relating to Palestinians. I'm working with methods that I didn't work with that much before, which is going to the Israeli public, and actually one of the methods that they use, or we use, is to talk to the Israeli public, to try to explain to the Israeli public about the situation, about the human rights violation, about the annexation, about the Jordan Valley, for example, and how many Palestinians live there, basic things that the Israeli public doesn't know, and also trying to influence the different bills and to raise some of the issue related to the Palestinian people in the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem, through the formal channels, through the Knesset committees, through members of the Knesset who can have also the voice of the people, and who can raise such kind of discussions. Sometimes, just raising the discussion, I think it's important, and under these circumstances. What else do you want to know?
I just want to know why. You could have been a civil lawyer. You could have been a criminal lawyer. I'm sure there are perhaps people in the family realm, I know I got the similar question too in my family, that ask you why you do this to yourself. What's the attraction in this area of work?
I think I wanted to be a doctor, not a lawyer. I think the discrimination I faced from the beginning, having the psychometry, which is an exam that you have to do, it was designed for more the Jewish people, not for Palestinian students. I was very good student at the high school, one of the top in my school and even in the country. And due to this exam that I had to do, which was not designed to the way I was studying in the Arab school in Israel, I wasn't able to be accepted to the medical school. And I think from that time, I felt the lawyer inside me. Later on, when I was in Haifa University and I decided to study law, one of the things I noticed is that I have to travel every day for 1 hour and a half in a bus going back and forward to my university, while other students have the right to be in the dorms. And my demand to get accepted to the dorms was denied. And when I searched a little bit, I noticed that it was denied because every Jewish has the right to get the dorms. It goes according to points, and they start with 25 points out of 50, just because they served in the army or had civil service. And I didn't do that, of course. And there was, dorms should be given to students according to their economic situation. So after I was accepted to Adalah, the first thing I did was submitting a case against Haifa University about the discrimination for being accepted to the dorms. And later on, I think the
Did you win?
Yes, we did win,
Yes.
but they changed the law. So sometimes you win, but they change the law. So you need to challenge again the law. So, but at least the court was to our side. So later on, I was introduced to HaMoked work at that time, and I think the Palestinian issue wasn't, everybody talked about, but I wanted to understand what is it, and I think by representing Palestinians and being able to live every case, I got connected to the issue, and I find it interesting. Sometimes it's frustrating to work on occupation, but we managed to help people. I earlier said I don't expect that the Israeli courts will end the occupation, but we can, through the courts, through the methods that we have, to help a lot of Palestinians to have access to basic rights, to the right to travel abroad, to the right to stay in their house, in their area, the right to be connected to clean water, or to have electricity, or even if I can't help Palestinians to have these kind of rights, I can advocate, I can talk about it to the press and raise this issue to discussion. Yet I know the limitation of my work. I know that that we need more than just going to the court to make a change. Also, the international community have to speak, to make a pressure, to raise the issue of the violation of Palestinian rights. And but as I said, it's the only effective issue way that we can work with, and I have a lot of satisfaction of my work, from my work. It's a small, one of my colleagues said, it's a small success that you need a microscope sometimes to see it, but it's still a success, and it's still a small change or it's a small hole in the wall that you made it, and if you continue to knock on it, you will have more and more. So
I think that's like one of the few blessings that we professional change makers who get paid for what we do every day. When we open the newspaper in the morning, and where we would otherwise just, be cursing from reading about the reality, and instead we get to go into our office and say, maybe I can change this somehow. It is a very satisfying feeling. You talked about the methods that Acrie is using, so I kind of want to use that as a segue to talk a little bit about the methods that human rights work uses. And I'll ask about Human Rights Watch and Omar. So Human Rights Watch's main tool is writing reports. Could you describe a little bit the theory of change of the work that you do? How does a report affect change? How does Human Rights Watch define change?
Sure. So maybe I can use the examples of the 5 areas I spoke about, because I think I spoke in general terms about, our theory. What we try and do is create pressure, exploit sort of weak points, and try and use that as a way to, push for more systematic change. So unlike Abir, who spoke, I think, very eloquently about helping individual people reclaim their rights, our work is much more about trying to sort of do research on patterns. We often, the people we interview, we don't change their lives. We usually, probably not at all, but the idea is maybe you can change the practice down the road, right? So for example, on our work around business and settlements, it comes from a theory that we've not succeeded in convincing the Israeli government to stop building settlements. We've not succeeded in pushing the United States or Europe to use their leverage to, stop Israel to build settlements. But we have had some success calling on businesses to adhere to their human rights responsibilities and not contribute to rights abuse. And that can be a way of sort of generating change in settlements and the human rights abuses, the systematic repression of Palestinians that are linked to the settlement enterprise. By contrast, our work on the closure of Gaza, Israel, in many ways holds a lot of the keys. It effectively controls Gaza. It's still the occupying power in our analysis. So we've tried to do research that shows, that the closure doesn't serve Israel's security interests, and that by robbing 2 million people of basic rights, you actually are becoming more insecure. And actually, I'm curious, your own analysis, Jonathan, or others, but, the Israeli security establishment, COGAT has been the most vocal in many ways among Israeli government institutions in recognizing that the closure policy, may not be actually serving Israeli interests. Mordecai, the former head of COGAT, called for a Marshall Plan for Gaza. And so we've tried to produce research that, we're not security experts, but we try to frame the rights abuses of issues that where there isn't a clear security rationale. By contrast, our work on the PA and Hamas security abuses, for the PA, they're largely dependent on donors, on European donors. And European donors tend to not realize the depth of how systematic arbitrary arrest and torture is. So instead of doing 7 reports on individual cases, we did 140-page report that looked at practices, over a number of years and a number of cases to show this is systematic abuse. And that's the sensitive point. When you have European states, telling the PA, hey, we fund your police and we're seeing these abuses, it actually creates a form of leverage.
I understand the particular change mechanism with regard to the Palestinian Authority. So they're dependent on European funding. Human Rights Watch writes a report, and that could affect their funding as an incentive to get better. As far as Israel, and this has been my experience throughout the 8 years working at Amnesty, is Amnesty's, they also do reports, but they also put out responses to different things that happen. And then like the main thing that they'll say is that is a violation of international law. And Israel would go, so like, what is the ramification of that?
Sure.
What is the ramification to the Israeli government of being damned in a Human Rights Watch report?
Let me give you a few examples, right? So, the International Criminal Court, we know that they now have, the prosecutors concluded a preliminary inquiry, and we're waiting for the court to hopefully confirm jurisdiction to open a formal probe. We've seen the Israeli government, the officials have directly said that certain policies, at some points annexation, demolition of Khan al-Ahmar, there have been a set of policies where it appears the threat of an ICC prosecution has changed decision-making. Another example is the database that I mentioned of businesses that operate in settlements. We've engaged companies who because of being listed on that database, which generates pressure, have pulled out of activities in settlements. And of course, that creates, we saw with Airbnb when it made the decision on the eve of our report release on Airbnb's role in settlements, pull out or announce they were pulling out. Obviously, they end up reversing under pressure. But these kind of things generate, if not an actual, create an actual form of pressure, they create a moral pressure, right? In a country like Israel, is not a country that wants to be seen as, a pariah, or a state that, that's outside the bounds of, it sees itself as a democracy. And so with my deportation, for example, we frequently mention that it's joining the ranks of countries like North Korea, Sudan, Egypt, that have kicked out Human Rights Watch researchers. And it's the same thing with our report, Born Without Civil Rights, we released in December. For the first time, one of the recommendations was we called on states to not just speak about solutions, but to speak about rights, and to say that any solution must ensure equal rights. For the first time ever, and I went to Europe to push this report in November, December, and in January, for the first time, we saw the EU and European states say, we want a solution that ensures equal rights for all people. Ultimately, we think that sort of language is actually the kind of thing that can generate real pressure on Israel in the long term, and can help Israelis in particular to realize that it's in their best interest to ultimately ensure justice and rights for Palestinians.
So there's a follow-up to that coming on chat. Paula Roderick is asking, we're seeing some modest change in the US Congress on conditioning aid, but can you point as to reports that might be helpful in pressuring Congress?
Yeah, I mean, look, Congress is the last institution on the earth that'll change, probably on this issue. But no, I think there is a progressive wing of the Democratic Party that is starting to use, different sort of language. I mean, we saw a letter drafted by some of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and supported by Bernie Sanders, speaking of apartheid, a term that Abir used earlier. I think that's a really marked change. And I think there is a shift in understanding that this idea of just repeating a slogan, a two-state solution or anything, or negotiations without actual consequences has no meaning. In fact, it's just a fig leaf that's supporting the status quo. I think more and more folks are in the Democratic Party are starting to realize, what's really at issue here, that this is a core issue of justice, human rights, discrimination. And I think that bodes for changes down the road. And I think some of the work we do in documentation and trying to shift the conversation is aimed at trying to produce and support those changes happening, not just in the US Congress, but in different parts of the world, Europe, etc.
Thanks, Omar. I'm going to segue through something that you said way earlier when you mentioned that Human Rights Watch has no position on the occupation in and of itself. To talk a little bit about peace work and human rights work are not always as similar as some might feel. So the scene is going together, but the differences between a rights-based approach and a political approach, for example, I've heard the argument back when I was working in Amnesty that sometimes advancing human rights can be counterproductive to achieving peace in the context of Palestine. So for example, and I'm actually going to turn to Abir first. So for example, if you go to the Supreme Court and get somebody his land back, so that's progress on a human rights level, but perhaps it's actually harmful, some would say, to the broader Palestinian cause that feels that only as the pressure intensifies could a larger political solution happen. What are your thoughts on that, Abir?
As organizations, we have this discussion for a long time, whether we should go to the Supreme Court or not go to the Supreme Court. But what else you can do right now, okay? If a Palestinian comes and his land was confiscated, can you as a human rights lawyer or as an organization prevent him from the chance of getting his land back? we had a success. Okay, it's not always we don't succeed in cases, but I will give you an example. The regularization settlement law that confiscate Palestinian private land. Okay, just because a settler built on this land by accident. He didn't know that it's Palestinian private land. And the Palestinian doesn't have the right to get his land back because they built on that land in good faith. They didn't know it belongs to a Palestinian. Should we go to the Supreme Court and challenge this law or not? Should we submit position paper against this law or not? We decided that we have to do that. You know, we cannot not challenge these kind of laws, and we did, and we succeeded. Does it mean that the Palestinian now will have their lands back? I doubt it. You know, I'm waiting for the next law that we are going to have, challenging or trying to confiscate Palestinian lands in different way. It's important to say that even though there is something called it's a long term, that you need the exhaustion of remedies. That means you need to address the Israeli courts first to try to get, since Israel controlling the Palestinians, in order to get the remedies in the country. So we are a local organization. We are not going to go internationally, okay? But we do that. We host remedies in Israel in cases that we think that we should do our work as organizations. And I want to ask a question. If we don't go to the courts, if we say, okay, we boycott the Israeli courts because we don't think that the ruling is good enough for Palestinians, then what? What kind of other methods we have today? You know, Omar talked about the International Criminal Court, but still it will take sometimes that it took a lot of time until we get to that stage. And I think that once the court decides that it can start the investigation, it will take more time, and also they need the materials. And the cases that a lot of human rights organizations did, and this is the base for everything, whether it's Palestinian or Israeli organization. So I don't think we have the privilege right now not to help Palestinians who need our help. And personally, you know, I had friends that think the opposite. But if a Palestinian woman who is sick, who comes to me and says, I need a permit to travel from Gaza to the West Bank, and there is no one who can help her, of course I will take the case. She can't wait until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict ends, or until she can't wait until we have peace agreements between the Palestinian and the Israeli. You can't deny life or basic rights from the Palestinians. We are dealing now, unfortunately, only with the humanitarian issues because Israel limited also the kind of permits that they give to the Palestinians for the basic needs. So we already, our flexibility is limited by the army and by Israel.
Okay, Omar, as I said, you mentioned before about that the organization doesn't have a position about occupation as such. What is your organization's position on war in general? Or, for example, during the Gaza conflicts, for example, did your organization call for an end to the fighting? And anticipating your answer, is it personally complicated for you to be in this part of the world to represent a position that perhaps doesn't take a position on war.
Yeah, no, I think Human Rights Watch believes that in order to have credibility investigating abuses in conflict, we should not take a position on the conflict, because otherwise you will be seen as, supporting, if one side you call it an unlawful war or occupation, then invariably you will be not objective when it comes to documenting abuses by all parties. So for example, in all the Gaza escalations, we document unlawful Israeli airstrikes where we find evidence of a disproportionate or deliberate targeting of civilian infrastructure. Similarly, we will call as a war crime Hamas's indiscriminate attacks on Israeli population centers. So certainly, I think there is a role for political work, a critically important work. And my old job at the Center for Constitutional Rights, they did not have that sort of line. They believed in movement lawyering and cause lawyering. You take the side of the cause you believe in and fight for it. But I also believe there is a value in principally sort of defending the principles, regardless of who the perpetrator is. I think it brings a credibility to our work. But I also want to add, if it's okay, Jonathan, a word on what you asked Abir, which is to say, when you look at Israel-Palestine, I think the biggest answer to your question is 53 years of occupation and decades, 27 years of a fruitless peace process should put to rest the notion that downplaying human rights will ease the path to a negotiated solution. I think the idea here is the center problem is not the absence of negotiations. You could negotiate. Netanyahu would happily negotiate today on the basis of, the Trump plan. The problem is, the core issue is structural violence, structural discrimination, is serious endemic rights abuse. So the response to structural abuse has to be human rights-based measures, accountability. It has to be, taking actions against perpetrators, stopping your complicity with those abuses. That's not to say we don't believe in peace, right? But you have to say human rights abuse are a symptom of the lack of peace is to pervert the reality. And I think, let me just end by saying this, at least in the US conversation, and I think it's a bit more of an informed conversation in Israel-Palestine, you would almost forget what the problem is that needs a two-state solution, because people talk about a solution without the problem. You would almost think the problem is the absence of a two-state solution, not that the problem is illegal settlements or the dispossession of Palestinians or a two-tiered regime that treats Palestinians separately, unequally. So let's start with addressing the problem, and let's create a reality in which Israelis and Palestinians can figure out the best political solution for themselves.
Absolutely, including some would argue that some of those most difficult systematic issues are not 53 years old, but 72 years old, but we're going to leave that for another conversation. You had prepared questions for each other?
May I add something?
Sure.
Omar mentioned the instructions for opening fire in Gaza, the demonstrations. It's one of the cases that Acri also with other organizations submitted to the court, and the court decided not to interfere, okay, in the instructions. And they said, okay, you can come with individual cases, and we will examine each case by its circumstances. So it's an example for the limitation of the Supreme Court. But again, you have to exhaust the remedies. You don't have the privilege of not trying to use the legal method as a pressure also on the army, on Israel, in order to stop the firing on people that they are approached or go to demonstration. So it's something that I think local human rights organizations do, and we know that there is a chance, and we try to make the court to interfere, and even if the court interferes, we don't always get the results that we want to get, and that's what happens usually in the principal cases. So I agree with Omar as well. If you ask a Palestinian today, what concerns him, he will tell you the general situation, my confiscated land, the fact that I don't have work, I don't have freedom of movement, I'm married to American, and my wife can't have a permit to stay with me in the West Bank. So it's the daily problems and needs that the people are facing, and some of it is because of the illegal settlements. Yes. So I just wanted to add this remark.
Thanks for that. And I'm trying a new method today, which is segueing into the open floor section by having panelists ask each other a question, surprising them with a question, something that they're curious about the other's work. Omar, would you like to go first with the question?
Yeah, I would love to hear from Abir of what gives her hope in the current situation.
Wow, tough question, Omar. What gives me hope? I think what gives me hope is my colleagues at work. In our organization, we have both Palestinian, Arab and Jewish lawyers and staff working together. And the fact that we see things the same way, it makes me optimistic. That there is people who share the same view that I do. They give me a lot of strength. Also, at times that you don't have power. And also, I have to say that people I meet during my visits to the different villages in the West Bank, people are very optimistic, although they live in a very hard and harsh situation, and they think they are there. I'm optimistic that they can stay on their land, although that sometimes they don't have water, they don't have appropriate housing, because everything they build, it will be demolished, and their kids have to walk to school tens of kilometers sometimes, and still they are optimistic. So if they are optimistic, I don't have the right to be pessimistic, and not to have the hope that things might change.
And your question to Omar?
My question to Omar. I looked, I have been your hearing at the Supreme Court, Omar, and looked at the case closely. Maybe one of the things I want to talk about before my question, occupation and annexation. Omar case is also an example of annexation, because the law that was used against for the deportation of Omar, talking about PDS, said that anyone who's talking or calling for PDS economically or indifferent or academically, in any area that in Israel or any area that Israel controls. And in that point, Israel didn't distinguish herself from the occupied Palestinian territories and the illegal settlements. So the annexation was in Omar case at that point, because even Omar talked about all the time the illegal settlements. He didn't talk to not to work with Israeli companies or or businesses that they are located in Israel. He talked about businesses that they are in the different settlements in the West Bank, and the Supreme Court didn't distinguish between that, between Israel and the area of Israel and the settlements, and an example of annexation and normalization over there. My question to Omar if your name was Brian Smith and you were blonde with blue eyes, do you we'll skip the blonde with blue eyes. Do you think that Arie Deri would deport you? And you know, the same circumstances, working for human rights, having the history that you have.
Yeah. It's a good question, Abir. If your career as a lawyer doesn't work out, you should be a TV interviewer. It's a very good question. I was actually asked this question by, I think, Udi Segel when I was at the airport, just about to board my plane. Similar, not as good, not worded as well as your question, Channel 12, I think. Look, I think it's important to note that my deportation case began with a decision not to allow Human Rights Watch to hire any foreign employee. And that was actually a decision that was an organizational decision before even considering my application. So this began and then obviously when we went public, their rationale was that Human Rights Watch are propagandists for Palestinians. When we went public and got all the pressure, they immediately sort of backtracked, and then eventually I got a work permit. Now, so I think that first thing had nothing to do with my identity. Now, when the second thing happened, that when the decision to deport me was taken, line 1 of the dossier says Omar is an American of Iraqi origin. And if you look at the tweets of Gilad Erdan and Arie Deri, it's very clear that they often throw in my background as if that sort of, means by nature that I am not capable of being objective. And in fact, I did many interviews with Israeli media, and I had some of them, and again, good intentioned journalists ask me, can you be objective given that your name is Omar? My predecessor was Israeli Jewish, and that was not a question she had to face about whether she could be objective doing this work. So on one hand, I think, Abir, it is a phenomenon that goes after people, even those that are Jewish, that are taking positions. On the other hand, I certainly think that some of the way my case has been viewed has been based on my identity and my background. So I think it's definitely part of the analysis. I tend to think the government would not have doubled down. They had several opportunities to not pursue this course of action. After the first time, after then we got an injunction, there was many moments in which the government could have pulled back, but every time they doubled down. After the Lad al-Qasim case in 2018, where an American student was in the airport for several weeks until the Supreme Court had to say she could enter the country. All of these could have been moments where they could have pulled back on my case, and they didn't. So I certainly think that my background was part of it. I think, unfortunately, discrimination permeates many aspects of Israeli policies and practices. But at the same time, the desire to clamp and shut down criticism extends beyond those that are of Arab origin.
So I'd like to invite Paula Roderick to just open your microphone for a sec and say hey, if that's all right, if you feel like.
Let me try to open her mic. Let's see.
And to say that Paula has been sending several questions on the chat while we're talking, and I think the common denominator, basically she's asking Omar, I'm in the States, I really want to affect the human rights situation in Israel and Palestine. What can I do? How can I be your activist? How can give me stuff to do?
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you, Avi. Yeah. Thank you. That's exactly what I'm looking for. And I see my friend Pat is in Boston, and she's on the line. I'm wondering if she's got that same question. I'm asking as an activist here in the States, where it's very important for me to feel that we are advocating for the rights of people in the questions and means that they are looking for. So not just putting on to somebody, this is what I think you ought to want. And it has resulted in some, sometimes some shifts, major shifts. I'm also an attorney, so I also wanted to ask Abir if that has also been her experience, that sometimes in wanting to advocate for people, they are asking for things and maybe you think you ought to advocate a little differently.
Thank you, Paula, and hi, Pat. And just before Omar and Abir answer, I just want to say to the floor, we have a couple more minutes for this conversation. If anyone else has a question, please indicate on the chat, and we'll see how time allows for another question after this one.
I'll be very quick. I'll be very quick, and this is part of, this is where we're different than Amnesty, because Amnesty, for example, maybe Jonathan's better to answer this question because they have, former Amnesty, but we're not actually a movement-based group, so we don't make necessarily popular calls for actions to be taken. We're much more sort of engaging directly decision makers. But what I will say, and this is maybe a good segue to a piece of my work we didn't talk about, is the anti-boycott laws in the United States. We now have, I think, 32 US states that have laws that in some way condemn or take punitive actions against those who call for boycotts. Human Rights Watch takes no position on boycotts. However, we defend the right of people to call for boycotts. And we've done research in addition to the free expression issue, which is, I think, quite prominent. We've done research that shows that the companies targeted by US anti-boycott laws are actually the companies that have made decisions based on human rights concerns, that are actually following their UN guiding principles, human rights obligations. So if you live in a US state that has one of these laws in place and you're a lawyer, and you mentioned you're a lawyer, I would see if there are ways you can partner with the local ACLU and others to challenge these laws. Many advocates, activists across the United States feel their rights are limited to speak out on these issues. So exactly. I would start local, and you being on this call, I'm sure you're somebody who's also already engaged on these issues. I also think there are really important voices now in the United States that are, I think, bravely speaking out on these issues. And I think it's an opportunity. There's so much misinformation in the United States. And I think the more that you can take reports by Arie and Bizchut and El-Haq, and you can, really use the platform you have and the relationships to talk about the reality. I saw a question in the chat about 72 years versus 53 years. Let me be clear. We document rights. My last report in May looked at discriminatory land policies affecting Palestinian citizens of Israel. And in many ways, the land confiscation they have faced is even worse than in the West Bank. If you look historically, I mean, you have a case where 20% of Israel's population, most of them live in Palestinian towns and villages, like the one that, Abir lived in the one Palestinian city, grew up in Nazareth, but, 3% about of the land of Israel is where the vast majority of 20% of the population lives. There are, hundreds of Israeli towns and villages that have admissions committees that effectively exclude Palestinians from living in them. So I just want to make the point too that, our research, our work talks about this. And I think that's something, for example, that even the American that knows a little bit about the conflict, maybe only knows about Gaza wars or the West Bank. They don't realize that, Israel itself structurally discriminates in virtually every aspect of life. And I think Abir spoke so eloquently about her own experience. And this is somebody who reached the top levels of Israeli education and success.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Omar. I can add that, Acri also does meetings with diplomats from different countries, embassies, in order to talk about the situation. It could be in Israel, it could be on the Palestinian occupied territories. We also have, as Omar mentioned, positions papers translated to English, reports that I would be happy also to share it with you if you leave your email. And you also can, leave your email at our website, and also B'Tselem provides a lot of information. So all the information you need is available and there that can help you. And and I'm here if you need any advice, or even to have any information in order to do your work in the States.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Paula, for your question. In follow-up to Omar's suggestion, I posted a link to Amnesty USA's action page. I know that they have a lot of local groups, and they have a volunteer Israel Palestine coordinator. I know her for years. Her name is Edith Garwood, who is passionate about finding as many activists in the States who want to take action based on reports on human rights violations that are being written in this part of the world, and to be writing to congressmen and writing to governments around the world. So please do check that out if that sounds interesting. I've also put up the websites of Human Rights Watch and of Acri for anyone who would like to follow up and support the work that our panelists do. I'm not seeing any more questions on the chat, which is good because we have 3 minutes left. So I'm going to ask an identical question to each of our panelists to kind of bring us to an optimistic close, which is how do you see the future? How do you see the situation in Israel-Palestine resolving? Will it resolve? When it will resolve? What's your dream on that? And specifically, like, what major things will have happened to achieve that reality?
You know,
if we could each take a minute or two to.
Abir, do you want to go first, or what would you like?
I can go first. I will talk as Abir, not as Acri right now, okay? As Abir, I don't think that we will ever have a two-state solution. I think it's too late. It's impossible, I have to say, on the ground. I think at the end, Israel is going to have, or going very fast to one-state solution. And I hope, you know, that yes, we'll have one-state solution. Everyone will have equal rights and civil rights, and that's how I see the future. You know, it's very hard for me to say that I see two-state solution in the situation that we are having. If you look at the maps, Trump maps, the Israeli maps, it's a joke what they are talking about. The other situation is to have this situation forever, you know, and we'll have more settlers in the West Bank, and more land confiscation, and less rights for the Palestinians. And we will continue having two legal systems, and we are going very fast to an apartheid regime. I said that earlier. So I hope that the Palestinian and the Israeli will sit and negotiate, but I don't think so. I don't think that this is going to happen soon. And also we need to remember that the Palestinian side is not strong. Although we are talking about the Palestinian Authority, but they don't have much power to control the situation. 60% of the land, Area C, is controlled by, Area C in the West Bank is controlled by Israel in all aspects of life. Those are my scenarios. Omar.
Yeah, look, I would say I didn't get to talk about what my favorite thing was about living in Israel and Palestine for 2.5 years. I mean, people, all these things, food, but I left with so much hope about civil society. I don't know if Jonathan, you know, or Abir agree with me, but I've never seen Israeli and Palestinian human rights communities as clear-eyed and as unified with an analysis and a sense of the shared struggle that we face. I feel in some ways the kind of awful reality we faced and where the politics are has made this committed group of dedicated individuals, you know, really on the same page. And I get a lot of hope when I see who the leaders are of the leading Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations. I think the conversation is shifting. And I don't think the Israeli government quite realizes, you know, where things are going, not just in the United States, but I'm talking also about not just in Europe, even in Israel and Palestine, the way that kind of the core committed group sees the reality. You know, I'll end by saying this. You know, talking about solutions is not my place. I'm not Israeli or Palestinian, and it's not my place to tell you what the solution is, states or identities, but you know, the values are there. There are many paths to peace, but none that are not rooted in the dignity and equality and justice for both Israelis and Palestinians. if I were to tell a 9-year-old about Israel Palestine, or even a 6-year-old, maybe not 6, maybe 8, about the situation today, I would do it in 3 sentences. And I said this earlier, but I'll sort of end with this. I would say that today there are 2 people that live in one land, Israelis and Palestinians, and Palestinians are treated unequally based on their identity. That's a really simple reality. And that's when the world, occupation, terrorism, it can muddle what's actually a quite simple, clear reality. And I think you're seeing some of the analysis of human rights groups, civil society groups shifting to bring that message into clarity. I don't think Jewish Israelis want that for the country. Many of whom came to Israel to escape anti-Semitic persecution. I don't think that's the country they want. That's not a country Palestinians want to live in. That's not a country that the world wants to see in the 21st century. And I think the more that reality comes into crystal clarity, the more that I think the status quo will be untenable. So I have a lot of hope for the medium and long term. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be a really long fight, but I'll end by saying what Abir said. We're going to keep poking holes in that wall, and I firmly believe that one day the wall of injustice, the systematic abuse, will fall. And the hardest part about having been deported, and I'm in a place in Amman where I feel Israel, Palestine all around you. I'm across the river, but I can't go, is that I won't be there myself to physically be there with people like Jonathan, Abir to tear down those walls. But I'll fight with every ounce and every fiber of my existence from here to do it.
Like Moses standing over the River Jordan and watching the promised land he can't come in. Yeah. Thank you for those parting words.